This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stone was Mazarin, the carbuncle was blue, and the mane was lion, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about what kind of chemistry experiments Sherlock Holmes was running? Or what a yeggman is? Or why Holmes's index was sorted haphazardly?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 416. Sherlock Holmes was no burglar. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
Don't forget the details. We look at those too. I'm Burt Wolder, the detail guy.
Very detailed. Well, Burt, you are no burglar, I'm proud to say.
No, I'm the detail guy. I'm shining up your dashboard there, and we're going to make it look like new.
Fantastic. Well, get out your diamond cutter, my friend. I know you've got a whole burglar's kit there.
Yes.
Oh, I'm
yes,
sorry. It's
I
a shaving kit. Shaving kit. It's how we refer to it these days.
Yes, it's a shaving kit.
Well, this is the third episode of the month, and this is the final installment in our Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist series of episodes that we've been doing here. This is our plan. Every third week of the month, we take a piece of Sherlockian scholarship that you may have missed, and we parse it apart. We share it with you, and then we give you our take on it. This is the last one in Season 8. We'll continue this tradition as we move into 2024 in Season 9 as well, because we think there is so much Sherlockian scholarship out there that helps us look at what the stories contained and analyzes them in different ways that it's worthwhile to have this discussion. Just as a reminder, if you would like to support the show in any way, you can do that by going to Patreon or Substack, patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. And in both places, I don't know if you realize this, in both places, you have the ability to gift someone a membership. That's right. You can give the gift of our little community and support the show at the same time. So check out the links. We'll have those in the show notes, the links to our gift subscriptions. We'd love to invite more people into this community here. And as always, if there's anything that we can do for you, anything that perhaps you have an idea to contribute to the show, and we have gotten some contributions, ideas for future topics, we'll be putting those into play in 2025 in Season 9. Just email us, trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Well, we are joined in this episode by one S. Tupper Bigelow in a piece that he has written, or did write, for the 1958 Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual, a piece called Sherlock Holmes Was No Burglar. Now, before you lead us down that path, Burt, the path to burglary, who was Tupper Bigelow?
Tupper Bigelow was the perfect person to kick this off and to write about this topic. He was one of Ontario's leading magistrates. His full name was Sherborne, I think, Sherborne Tupper Bigelow, and he went by S. Tupper Bigelow. So he was one of Ontario's leading magistrates. And among other things, he's the gentleman who, the legal scholar and justice who who straightened and out and organized racing in Canada. And, was a wonderful legal scholar and a real leader. And many of his works were fundamental to Sherlockian scholarship. He was born in 1901 and died at the age of 92 in 1993. Wow. And I think he came from Regina, from Saskatchewan, Canada. But that's S. Tupper Bigelow, quite an accomplished gentleman and a great Sherlockian.
Yes. And he had it in his mind to defend the good honor of Sherlock Holmes in this piece, stating that Sherlock Holmes was no burglar. And he's going to take us through a number of stories and give us a lawyer's analysis as to what was what. Because he says it's been taken for granted for a long time that Sherlock Holmes did a number of things that scholars have called, quote unquote, burglary. Now, some may be readily forgiven because the master himself seemed to be under the impression of, on more than one occasion, that he was guilty of that offense. Others who have analyzed the stories from a legal or quasi-legal aspect cannot be so readily forgiven for their indefensible slur, if not actual libel on the master, even though they could plead mitigation of damages, that Holmes himself had described himself as a burglar and admitted a course of conduct that implicitly had some criminality about it. So, let's look at instances of quote-unquote burglary in the canon and then see what Tupper Bigelow has to say about actual burglary.
Yeah, that exactly right. And I just wanted to point out to our listeners that this is one of the great traits of Sherlockian scholarship that's really lasted through the ages. What's happening here is that Tupper Bigelow is taking his own personal interests and experience about the law and about crime and about exactly what the qualifications and issues and legal ramifications of burglary are, and combining it against the premise that Sherlock Holmes is really a great hero. And so how could he have been engaged in activities that were against the law? How can this be? And so he's, as you say, he started us out here and then gets to some examples. He says, in The Retired Colorman, well, Holmes tells Inspector McKinnon, there being no fear of interruption, I proceeded to burgle the house. And in the Bruce Partington plans, he and Watson have a jemmy and a dark lantern and a chisel and a revolver. They break and enter into Oberstein's residence. And Watson says, Mycroft Holmes and Lestrade had come round by appointment after breakfast the next day, and Sherlock Holmes had recounted to them our proceedings of the day before. The professional, i.e. Lestrade, shook his head over our confessed burglary. Well, and then Holmes fancies himself as a burglar too, says Bigelow, had he chosen to adopt a criminal career in Milverton. Holmes tells Watson, I don't mind confessing to you that I've always had an idea that I would have made a highly efficient criminal. And then, of course, he's got his first-class, up-to-date burglar kit, his diamond-tipped glass cutter. And then in The Retired Colorman, Holmes says burglary had always been an alternative.
But before you go on there, we have from Holmes' own mouth, he admitted, he said, I mean to burgle Milverton's house tonight.
Yes. And then he's got all the tools, his little leather case. Very handy. See, I've got all this. Yeah. An up-to-date burglar kit. A nickel-plated jemmy. No, not just an ordinary jemmy.
Oh, that's how you know you're invested in it.
Adaptable keys. Every modern improvement which the march of civilization demands. My dark lantern. Everything is in order, so he's all set.
Yeah.
And clearly he's been to burglar school. He probably had a correspondence class in burglar schooling. And then in The Retired Colorman, he tells Inspector McKinnon, burglary has always been an alternative profession. Had I cared to adopt it, I have a little doubt that had I done so, I should have come to the front.
Yeah, see, Holmes, as always, the consummate professional, takes it seriously. So, and of course, we come to understand that Holmes knew something or another about burglars. I remember in the Abbey Grange, he says, "A matter of fact, burglars who have done a good stroke of business are, as a rule, only too glad to enjoy the proceeds in peace and quiet, without embarking on another perilous undertaking." So he has the mindset of burglars. He understands their mentality when it comes to spending the loot or secreting the loot.
Well, and then Bigelow points to another great Sherlockian, J. Finley Christ, who had compiled an irregular guide to Sherlock Holmes. And in that, Christ had listed 4 cases of burglary. And Bigelow calls those out. Burglary by Holmes, well, we've talked about some of those. Milverton, 6 Napoleons, Bruce Partington plans. And then a separate little listing, Sherlock Holmes burglar acts as. Holmes acting as a burglar. And there he lists Milverton, Greek interpreter, Bruce Partington plans, retired columnist. Well, Bigelow says, note the distinction between burglary and acting as a burglar. Well, far from being a subtle distinction, this is the theme of what I'm writing about, because there's a vast distinction, says Bigelow, from being a burglar and acting as one. In any event, he says, Christ lists only 3 cases in which Holmes was a burglar, and a total of 5 in which he was or appeared to be a burglar.
This is a fantastic legal defense. I think the next time, or the first time, I'm accused of a crime, whatever the crime is, I'm going to say, no, I'm not a criminal. I was acting as a criminal. I'm not a murderer. I was acting as a murderer. I'm not a fraud. I was acting as a fraud.
Right. You see, I'm in a local theater production of Arsenic and Old Lace, so I didn't really put a body in the window seat. I'm just rehearsing.
Oh, marvelous.
Yeah. Well, and then he points to another essay that by another writer who talked about analyzing the crimes at Appledore Towers, but Bigelow goes on, he says, well, there are things in the illustrious client that, sort of support this basic idea. This other writer says Holmes's major crimes, such as burglary, really reflect the fulfillment of a desire to become a highly efficient criminal. But in the illustrious client, Holmes was in fact threatened with prosecution for burglary. Well, that's a little different thing from clearly implying that burglary was committed. He was threatened with prosecution for burglary. So we've got alleged burglaries or pseudo-burglaries, and then you've also got things in the Red Circle and the Speckled Band and a scandal in Bohemia, since all of those involve Holmes's unlawful entry into private premises. And then in Lady Frances Carfax, Holmes is called a burglar. So that's something we should be looking at. Well, then Bigelow with this introduction, gets us to the law. He says, what was burglary in England in Holmes's time?
And he goes on to help us understand the Larceny Act, 1916, was nothing new at the time. It was a codification of the common law of larceny as it existed up until that time. And we can take its statutory force in 1969. It had legal effect from the date of the earliest story in the canon. Section 25 reads, every person who, in the night, 1, breaks and enters the dwelling house of another, having A, entered the said dwelling house with the intent to commit the felony therein, or B, committed any felony in the said dwelling house, shall be guilty of a felony called burglary. So it's breaking and entering and having the intent to commit the felony.
Or committed any felony in the said dwelling house. So if I break in because I'm hungry or I forgot my key or something, and then I realize I'm in the wrong house and I decide to take the piano, then despite the fact that it was all a mistake, I'm still guilty. And then another section in the law defines night. Night means the interval between 9 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning of the next succeeding day.
Thank you for that.
So if I do that at 8:30, if I get in a half hour early, I can keep the piano.
Good luck proving that. That's the only thing.
Well, if I steal a watch.
Now you're talking.
Now I'm talking.
Yeah. So he said we should look at Section 51 of the Malicious Damage Act from 1861. That describes malicious damage as the misdemeanor rather than felony. And we should perhaps consult Russell on Crime, an authoritative legal text in England. He said, in order to constitute the offense of burglary, there must be a breaking of the dwelling house. If a man enters a house by a door or a window which he finds open, or through a hole in which is made there before, and steals goods, he draws goods out of a house through such a door, window, or hole, he's not guilty of a burglary. It's your fault for leaving the door open. You're inviting the criminals. And Bigelow says the lay reader might think it's somewhat captious or hair-splitting to take such a high ground that according to the letter of the law, burglary can only take place at night when a layman's conception of burglary is breaking and entering at any time, day or night. Well then, let's go along with the layman's opinion. We shall call the offense mentioned in Section 25 of the Larceny Act burglary, and the offense described in Section 27 as unlawful entry. And admit for the purpose of this thesis that it is a kind of burglary as well. So now all we have to do is take this analysis and apply it to the cases.
I wonder if an attorney, a solicitor, arguing before Justice Bigelow had pursued this sort of an argument, if he would have been amused by it or thrown it out in a real case. Well, Your Honor, it is a kind of burglary, but it's not really burglary. Well, anyway, Bigelow then, and now we're in the meat here of the essay on our way to the exits here. He says, let's take a look at these cases. Well, Milverton. Okay, so Holmes and Watson break and enter into Milverton's dwelling house, and it is at night, but there's no intention, of committing a felony. Their only intention is to break open a safe and destroy blackmailing assets. So this is malicious damage. It's a misdemeanor, not a felony. And now, true, they see a felony committed, and they are accessories after the fact to murder, but that's kind of an accident. So they're not guilty of burglary or unlawful entry. Well, and then the 6 Napoleons. Burglary was committed here, but not by Holmes. And then Bigelow points out some scholars have accused Holmes of having been a receiver of stolen goods, the Georgia Pearl. And in criminal law, that seems to be true, but not really. I mean, Holmes's title to the pearl is good against Mr. Sandiford of Reading, but not against the original owner, the Prince of Kelowna. So I just love this analysis. And then we get to the Bruce Partington plans.
Yes, and we know that Holmes and Watson broke into Oberstein's home, but they didn't intend to commit a felony. Holmes was there looking for incriminating documents, or the Bruce Partington plans themselves. And having found some documents, he and Watson left, and later they re-entered the house with Lestrade and Mycroft. So no one in that group had an intention of committing a felony on either occasion. So, if Holmes had found the plans, well, he probably would have gotten them, but he's recapturing stolen goods. He's not stealing in that case.
And one of the nice things about this is that, and Bigelow does this from time to time, one of the many nice things, he drops in what he's calling, in parenthesis, an irrelevant and gratuitous note. Because this whole thing, he's having a conversation with the reader. And here, Bigelow says, it seems odd that Holmes, in the Bruce Partington case, didn't know the names of the principal foreign spies in London and had to ask Mycroft for them. But in an earlier story, in The Second Stain, he was thoroughly familiar with them. Had he mislaid his index?
Interesting. See, that's a trifle right there.
Yeah,
a trifle within a trifle. I like that.
Mislaid index. Well, and then we're in the Greek interpreter. And, the villains here have been guilty of a lot of things. Murder, attempted murder, extortion. But remember, Watson had earlier said it was more than an hour before we could get Inspector Gregson and comply with the legal formalities which would enable us to enter the house. So this clearly means Gregson was busy getting a search warrant. And there you are. And then with the search warrant, the police had every right to enter the home, the Myrtles, by force or otherwise. And Holmes was just an assistant. So that's not burglary at all.
And here we have another irrelevant and gratuitous note. It seems a pity, though, that these desperate characters were not hunted down and punished, even though Harold Latimer and Wilson Kemp killed each other shortly after at or near Budapest. They were, no doubt, buried in Austria-Hungary under the provisions of the Local Improvements Act.
Local Improvements Act. Well, now we're into the retired colorman, where you remember Holmes admitted in the case he burgled Josiah Amberley's house, the Haven. But we will not accept that admission of guilt any more than we would accept it in the Milverton case, because when he entered, he had no intention of committing a felony. His only purpose was to find out how and where Mrs. Amberley and Dr. Ernest were murdered. We're told that Holmes slipped out through the pantry window. Well, that doesn't look like a violation of Section 25 of the Larceny Act to me. No felony was contemplated or committed. And then we're off to the illustrious client.
Yeah, Baron Gruner. Remember, you heard a noise in his inner study, rushed in, and Watson gives us the scene. He said, 2 steps took me to the open door, and my mind will ever carry a clear picture of the scene within. The window leading to the garden was wide open. Beside it, looking like some terrible ghost, his head girt with bloody bandages, his face drawn in white, stood Sherlock Holmes. So Holmes had stolen the Baron's love diary, and if he had broken to enter the inner study, the time of the break-in surely must have been before 9 p.m. As Watson's appointment was for 8:30. And Holmes's arrival on the scene would not be long after. We must acquit Holmes of burglary. As for unlawful entry, while Holmes had every intention of committing larceny, there's no evidence of breaking in the can. The window was open. Right? It might have been open before Holmes got there, since it was early September. And in every criminal case, if there's reasonable doubt, we must give it to the benefit of the accused. So we assume there is unquestionably reasonable doubt here with respect to Holmes and Baron Gruner's study and the open window.
And now we're getting towards the end. Bigelow tells us, well, what about the Valley of Fear? That's where Holmes is talking about Moriarty to Inspector Alec MacDonald. And Holmes says, I have been 3 times in his rooms, twice, waiting for him under different pretexts and leaving before he came. And it was on the last occasion I took the liberty of running over his papers with the most unexpected results. Well, Bigelow says, there's no evidence there's any breaking in, and looking over somebody's papers isn't a felony. It's not even a misdemeanor. Whatever Holmes did here, there's no evidence it was either burglary or unlawful entry. Case dismissed. And then the red circle, he says, all Holmes did here in the way of burglary was to enter a vacant apartment through an open door with the cooperation of the police. Well, the police are merely minions of the law, not the law. That's not burglary. And then we're then we're into the speckled band.
Yeah, Holmes entered an open window in Stoke Moran with no consent of the owner, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, but with the consent, of course, of Miss Stoner. She placed the lamp in the window there. And there was no intent to commit a felony, even so. Rather, the intent was to prevent one being committed and ascertain how an earlier one had been committed, not guilty. And over to a scandal in Bohemia, Holmes, Watson, and the King of Bohemia arrived at Irina Adler's vacated premises with the intent to commit a felony therein, to wit, to steal the compromising photograph, but the door to Briony Lodge was open, so there was no breaking. As for unlawful entry, well, Miss Norton's servant permitted, or at all events made no effort to prevent the entry. So, and the entering, by the way, was not at night. Shortly after breakfast time is when it occurred.
Yeah, that time gets you off.
Yeah.
Well, the last case Bigelow looks at here is the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, because Holmes has traced Holy Peter's to this house in Pulteney Square. And Holmes gets his foot in the door and gets into the house. And when he starts to search for Lady Frances, Holy Peter says, "Where's your warrant?" Holmes half drew a revolver from his pocket. "This will have to serve till a better one comes." And Peters, of all people, says, "Why, you are a common burglar." "So you might describe me," says Holmes cheerfully. Well, Bigelow points out, the word burglar, as used by Holy Peters, was a figure of speech, employed much as a layman uses the word as a generic reference to thieves and larcenous characters of all kinds.
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment. So Bigelow concludes that it must be apparent to everyone that the master has been reviled and traduced over many decades, and it's been devoutly hoped that this defense of his allegedly burglarious, I love that word, burglarious activities, has not come too late to give him solace and comfort on the occasion of his 105th birthday next month in his happy retirement upon the Sussex Downs. May it cheer him, in fact, to the extent that he will live forever, as he undoubtedly will in any case. And then he ends with another irrelevant and gratuitous footnote. I think we missed the boat on this, Bert. We should have named this podcast Irrelevant and Gratuitous.
Well, those are nicknames for us, I think. Are you
irrelevant?
No, it's not irrelevant. It's a hippopotamus. But that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
But that's splendid. You've got it.
The house appears to be unoccupied. Oberstein obviously having gone abroad to dispose of his booty. He has no reason to fear a warrant. On a spot of amateur burglary would never occur to him, but that is precisely what we are about to do.